Hello and welcome to Lecture 7 in the series Russia's War Against Ukraine. In the last lecture we talked about the Ukrainian national idea, which in a word is freedom. An idea, an idealisation. Today we'll be talking about the reality of Ukrainian politics, Ukraine's informal politics, which, you might not be too surprised, doesn't always necessarily live up to that ideal. We'll be talking about 5 things. First of all, political technology, the thing that we talked about that corrupts the Russian political system from Lecture 1. We'll be talking about oligarchy, about the lack of a rule of law in Ukraine, and how that creates opportunities for Russian influence and corruption. So firstly, why is there so much informal politics in Ukraine? Partly that's because Ukraine is a post-Soviet state. Informal politics exist in Ukraine for the same reasons they exist in Russia. Informality grew as a phenomenon during totalitarian rule because intermediary social structures were suppressed. Ukraine also became independent very quickly. It therefore passed what was called a law on succession in September 1991. It sounded like a good idea at the time because basically it stated that all law, Soviet law, carries over into independence unless otherwise specified. So it created a ready body of law, but it also created too much continuity with the Soviet era. Under the first 2 presidents, Leonid Kravchuk and Leonid Kuchma, informality flourished. Ukraine was very late at creating institutions such as a constitution for an independent state. In fact, Ukraine was the last post-Soviet state to adopt a proper constitution, and not a very good one, with many contradictions in 1996. And the key informal practice that developed in the 90s was oligarchy. It took until 2004 for a counterpoint to begin. This was the Orange Revolution at the end of Kuchma's period of rule against many of the corrupt practices that had developed and spread by 2004. Orange Revolution had some successes, but a decade later Ukraine has another revolution, the Revolution of Dignity. 2013 to 2014. So, since 2004, you've had both corrupt post-Soviet practice and a counterpoint to it. So some political reforms since 2004. So Ukraine has tried to reform its post-Soviet self. First problem is political technology. In fact, political technology is not only common in Ukraine, it's especially common. Ukraine is kind of a hub state for political technologists, political consultants from all over the world. Here we show 3. Firstly, bottom left, Timofey Sergeytsev. Now, he became notorious in 2022 for an openly genocidal article calling for the denazification of Ukraine. But he worked on local political campaigns in Ukraine in the 90s, early noughties. Second picture, after him came Paul Manafort, an American, a Republican strategist who worked in Ukraine for a decade before returning to the US to be Donald Trump's campaign manager in 2016. Thirdly, bottom right, Ihor Hrynev. Ukraine has plenty of local political technologists too. And in Orange in Ukrainian, it describes him simply, accurately, as Poroshenko's political technologist, the last president before Volodymyr Zelensky. So Ukraine has political technology. It doesn't have it to the same extent as Russia. It hasn't spread into other areas like the weaponization of history or foreign policy. It's not possible to use political technology to control the entire political system, as in Russia. In fact, key to understanding how political technology works in Ukraine is that Ukraine does have a very robustly competitive political system. So the type of political technologies that are used are all about gaining the edge in that robust competition. So some examples. Last presidential election, 2019, there was a lot of what was called man marking or woman marking, a metaphor from football. This is quite complicated, which is partly the point. Bear with me. In this election, first round, Zelensky came first, 30%. Below him are all the other candidates. Each candidate, as well as running themselves, marked their opponents, their closest opponents, with a third candidate, a so-called clone, who was politically similar to their opponent, who could take votes off their opponent. Complicated. But one reason why Zelensky emerged at the head of the pack was that there was no clone effectively to take votes off him, whereas everybody else was handicapped by the fact that in this kind of war of all against all, people were using political technology to take votes off each other. Trolls and bots. Ukraine has plenty of these online, but it doesn't have the centralized, state-run Russian internet research agency run out of St. Petersburg. What it does have, again, is competitive politics, with each politician having their own bot armies. So this cartoon shows the Porokho botti. So you can see former President Poroshenko, his portrait on the wall, and his troll army, therefore, are known as the Poroshenko bots, the Porokho botti. Another political technology, almost unique to Ukraine, not quite unique, because it's actually exported from Ukraine to some other countries, like Moldova. If you have competitive elections, then you can often gain the edge by simple, crude vote buying. In Ukraine, this is called grechka, which means buckwheat. One of the products that you can hand out to try and buy votes, or simple cash. But this is often organized. It's not just random supply of goods. Goods are collected, goods are distributed in networks of influence called seti or sitki, organized by political technologists and with characteristic modes of organization to make sure that people vote in the way that they've been bribed to. Hyperpolarized elections were a problem in the noughties and the Yanukovych area, 2010, 2014. These were organized by the American Paul Manafort. What he did was take what in America is called the Southern strategy. So here we have two maps of American elections. Why? Well, in the paradigmatic case before the Southern strategy, 1960, Democrats tended to win American elections, and they won in an alliance of northeastern and former Confederate states. So 1960, JFK beats Richard Nixon. So the Southern strategy was all about persuading the Southern states to vote Republican instead, shifting their votes to culture voting rather than socioeconomic interests. So by 2016, you can see the success of this strategy in the election where Trump defeats Hillary Clinton. He wins every state in the Old South, shown in red. So Manafort took this strategy and it imported it into Ukraine. Here are three Ukrainian elections, 91, 99, 2019. Not necessarily polarized at all, not split down the middle. 2019, Zelensky won a big landslide in most regions of Ukraine. But what Manafort did was polarize culture politics, east and center versus south and east, within Ukraine, rather than north versus south in America. East versus south, east versus west, beg your pardon, geopolitically, right, in terms of foreign policy choice, language, culture buttons that he continually pushed. So here, in 2010, you do have a very divided Ukraine, divided between support for Yulia Tymoshenko in yellow and Manafort's candidate Viktor Yanukovych in eastern and southern Ukraine and Crimea. This was hugely damaging. Ukraine has had to live with the effects of this polarization ever since. But it was not the case that Ukraine, although divided and diverse, was fundamentally split down the middle in the way that Manafort made it. He took dotted lines and inked them in. Since then, there has been greater national unity. More on that in a moment. Manafort's black arts, again in this highly competitive environment, also included black PR, setting up fake think tanks to push his client's message, employing former politicians, because these were all for Central Europe. They were nicknamed the Habsburg Group, and planting stories in global media in favor of his client, President Yanukovych, and against his opponents. These methods often produce disillusion with the political system and the desire to replace corrupt existing political parties with new ones. So, Ukraine can fake that as well. Right? There's been a series of protest parties which were also created by political technology to deflect that desire for new faces. Volodymyr Zelensky himself also used some types of political technology to win election. That doesn't mean he was entirely fake or virtual, but he rose within an environment where it made sense to use these methods to convert his fame as a celebrity into a successful politician via the TV series Servant of the People, first playing a president and then becoming one in real life. So Ukraine has a lot of political technology. It also has oligarchy, created by informal practice. Not just businessmen or rich billionaires, not just people who become rich through economic activity, but people who earn their money from Ukraine's post-Soviet, semi-reformed condition, who gain rent rather than income. Rent being defined as basically money earned from a monopoly position or from political privilege. Oligarchs, if they rule, create oligarchy, rule by the few. And what is important in this excellent book by Geoffrey Winters is, quote, oligarchs are actors who command and control massive concentration of material resources that can be deployed to defend or enhance their personal wealth and exclusive social position. Oligarchy refers to the politics of wealth defense by these materially endowed actors. So what's key here is oligarchs corrupt politics. Right? And Ukrainian oligarchs are intensely competitive. They haven't been reined in by the state, much as they were in Russia after Putin consolidated power in the noughties. One president, Viktor Yanukovych, did come close to putting all the oligarchs under his authority, but largely through coercion, brute force. Ukraine's natural condition is more competitive and pluralistic. These are the main oligarchs who've been remarkably persistent through Ukrainian independence, last 30 years. These are the sources of their power, the media that they own and the political parties that they have backed. So wealth defense, corrupting politics, creates a kind of continual circle in Ukraine. Oligarchs control TV. They promote parties and politicians. They then occupy positions in the state, and the Ukrainian terms for that, smotriashi, those who look after oligarchs' interests. Curators, those who deliver for oligarchs. Oligarchs gain more wealth, and the cycle begins again. And that cycle has not really been broken by attempts at revolution. Though in the final lecture, we will talk about how war has disrupted Ukrainian oligarchy much more radically than anything else. Even the election of Zelensky, even the landslide that he won personally, and then for his political party, that's servant of the people, 254 out of 450 seats in 2019. Even that didn't fundamentally undermine the power of Ukrainian oligarchy. They were still able to use their media and, crucially, the judiciary to protect their interests. Who remembers this guy, Dmitry Razumkov? He was the chair of parliament until the eve of war. Ukraine's richest oligarch, Rinat Akhmetov, fell out with the government. He had problems with his business interests, so he started promoting Razumkov as a rival politician to Zelensky. And in 2021, they were pretty close in the opinion polls. Right? Razumkov now is nowhere. He's like 2% in the polls, and Zelensky is over 80. So a lot has changed. But on the eve of war, you still had the same old methods of influencing politics. This is why Ukraine is so corrupt. Not because it's inherent in Ukrainian culture or an inalienable part of the Ukrainian economic system. It's politics which creates corruption. So even in a kind of post-Soviet league table, 15 states with Estonia at the top, Ukraine is below average. More corrupt even than Kazakhstan, down at 116th place in the world in 2022. One of the most important political technologies is called legal technology. In fact, you don't need to fix elections. You don't need expensive TV channels. If you can place your people into the legal system, where they have veto powers to prevent reform or challenges to oligarchs' interests. The legal system in Ukraine is complicated and corrupt. No real rule of law. Judiciary regulates itself. You have a very powerful general procuracy and security service called the SBU. Too big, too powerful, and too unreformed. And you have a lot of equivalent to political technology within the legal system. Informal practice, like telephone justice. Someone rings up the judge, or probably sends him an SMS nowadays, or a WhatsApp, or more secure message. So no longer telephone justice, but social media justice, perhaps. The people who organise this, Ukraine's lawyers, are numerous. Most common slogan of Ukrainian lawyers is "Решает любой вопрос," which means we solve any question. We don't exist, we don't charge you a lot of money because of our knowledge, but because we can get things done. We have contacts, we have our people in the legal system who will organise all these informal practices. We don't need to go into the details, but the fact that there are so many explains why there are so many corrupt judges, the so-called black crows within the legal system, who look after their own, that's what SSEES says here, and act against honest elements within the legal system, the foreign elements. The counterpoint is Ukraine's revolutions. Orange Revolution 2004, Revolution of Dignity 2014. Zelensky as president since 2019. All of these have made some difference. Since 2014, you have an open procurement system, that's called Prozoro, which is Ukrainian for transparent, a new National Anti-Corruption Bureau. There are fewer what Ukrainians call schemy, grand schemes of mega corruption. But the judiciary is still highly corrupt. Judicial reform would take hours to describe because it's so crazily complicated. And all of the other institutions, the General Prosecutor's Office, the security services, still pretty much unreformed. Zelensky had another go in his pre-war presidency, if you like, 2019 onwards. Some good things were done. The DIA app, for example, meaning action, getting things done, deeds. Hugely important, in fact, a global standard for obtaining state services online. Now that's great and it's convenient, and Ukraine couldn't have survived the current war without it, but it's also to reduce corruption. You bypass bureaucrats, you don't need to pay them bribes. Zelensky has abolished MPs' complete blanket immunity. They were above the law, impossible to prosecute for any illegality. But he's also had huge problems, or had huge problems before the Russian invasion, in confronting this incredibly corrupt judiciary and judicial system. In fact, all of these veto players, oligarchs and so on, in the year before the war, had used the power of the Supreme Court and Constitutional Court to try and block, roll back post-2014 reforms. So in 2021, Zelensky had to resort to the National Security and Defence Council rather than Parliament to try and take on these challenges to his rule and to reform. And also take on Russian influence. These malpractices within the Ukrainian system are a problem in themselves, but they also create the opportunities for Russia to exercise the influence that it does, or did. Russian political technologists were common in Ukraine, at least until the era of Paul Manafort after the Orange Revolution. Simple bribery of Ukrainian politicians often works. Since 2014 at least, we've had hybrid war. In previous lectures, we've talked about the problem in defining that and defining when hybrid war starts, given that it is so many things. Some would go back earlier to 2004. So a mixture of military, political, and covert pressures, particularly the buying of agents of influence within all of these weak points in the Ukrainian political system, in the oligarchy, in the judiciary. You had a mixture of military and political technology methods in 2014, in the so-called Russian Spring, when the creation of extra propaganda was hugely important. The first thing that Russians did when they moved into Crimea and the Donbass was to create propaganda mini-states. Physical, often military action was supported online. Demonstrations were often artificial or inflated by what were called special tourists, specturisti, imported from Russia. But so-called putingi, the Russian for meeting is meeting, so meetings plural is meetingi. So pro-Putin meetings, putingi, were often created by, or their size was increased by, political technologists and Russian intelligence curators, controllers. Russia got some success with this. It annexed Crimea, and the two republics were created in the Donbass. But after 2015, you got a continuation war, but on a lower level. Russia therefore shifted its tactics more towards undermining Ukraine in general, to what in Russian is called fonovaya technologia, background technology, influencing the general background conversation. In this case, that was symbolized as #zrada, Ukrainian word for betrayal. We've been betrayed by everything. Everything is bad. The graph shows a regular question in opinion polls. Do you think the country is heading in the right or the wrong direction? Right direction, blue, wrong direction, red. You can see the lines almost converge. Optimism during Revolution of Dignity 2014. But then they diverge again. And negative opinion gets stuck at the same level, 70%. Regardless of how the economy is doing, how the war is developing, it becomes a kind of fixed social media reality, unaffected by real-world events. Russia moved into building up new media influence, particularly through this guy and his TV, Viktor Medvedchuk. First picture, you see him next to Putin. Medvedchuk has a daughter. Putin is his literal godfather. In Ukrainian, you can also see the NGO behind Putin, Ukrainsky Vybor, Ukrainian Choice, that Medvedchuk headed. Medvedchuk created 3 TV channels, but he was just the first wave. There were others behind him, particularly this guy, Yevhen Murayev, who created another TV channel called Ours or Nash. So when Medvedchuk's empire was dismantled in 2021, a lot of viewers moved to this alternative channel instead. As well as TV channels, you had Russian propaganda in social media, online, new websites, exploiting politainment, political/news websites, pro-Russian fake NGOs promoting an agenda that was not obviously pro-Russian but tended to be pro-peace, or spreading this idea that everything in Ukraine was #zrada, failing. A lot of this involved bots, particularly on social media like Telegram. In the yellow diagram you can see how a periodic cleansing of Twitter accounts meant that Medvedchuk actually lost 311,000 followers overnight because so many of them were bots, although he rebuilt later. The blue diagram shows the interaction between pro-Russian and domestic networks on Telegram, particularly popular source of disinformation. How vulnerable, how open was the Ukrainian political system and its many points of vulnerability to Russian influence? So, despite the ongoing war against Ukraine, very much ongoing since 2014, Russia has been able to use other covert methods to build influence within Ukraine. Ukraine's political technology creates vulnerabilities. Ukraine's corrupt judiciary creates vulnerabilities. Russia has been able to rebuild media influence. Russia has been able to spread its messages of #zrada, everything in Ukraine is bad or has been betrayed, via social media in particular. This is one reason why Medvedchuk's TV empire was actually dismantled, and then he was arrested in 2021. Now, since the invasion, he's actually been under arrest. A lot of people actually use this to explain timing of Russian invasion, that Russia had been relatively successful in spreading propaganda and it didn't want that effect to dissipate. But there was also a personal element involved, that Putin felt obliged, in a mafia sense, to support his guy. There were accusations of even coup attempts. Zelensky accused leading oligarch Rinat Akhmetov in November 2021. Western intelligence accused many of these networks of being in Russian pay, and more of that in Lecture 8, in terms of how actually things panned out after the invasion. Ukraine had prepared and therefore passed a law on collaboration to try and clamp down on many of these networks. The law was actually passed shortly after the invasion. Overall then, Ukraine was, to some degree, vulnerable to Russian influence because of its political technology, because of its corrupt judicial system, because Russia was able to buy up some local politicians, because Russia could spread its background technology messages in social media. So these vulnerabilities come from all of the problems that existed in Ukraine's less than perfect political system before invasion in February 2022. Paradoxically, a lot has been done to clean up the Ukrainian political system since February. Ukraine has had to deal with many of the vulnerabilities to Russian influence that had been created. More of that in our final lecture, Lecture 8.